Albert Séverin Roche was born on March 5, 1895, in the small village of Réauville in the Drôme department of southeastern France. He was the third son of Séverin Roche and Louise Savelle, a modest farming family who worked the land with their hands and depended on every able body to maintain their livelihood. The Roche family lived a simple life, bound to the rhythms of the seasons and the demands of agricultural work. Young Albert grew up among the fields and vineyards of Provence, a small and rather frail boy who seemed better suited to lighter tasks than the heavy labor of farm life. In 1913, when Albert was 18 years old, he presented himself before an assessment board of the French army. The officers who examined him took one look at his slight frame and quickly rejected him, deeming him too puny and physically inadequate to serve in the military. This decision apparently delighted his father, who needed every available hand to run the farm and stated matter-of-factly, "We need arms to run the farm." For Séverin Roche, having his son deemed unfit for service was a blessing. It meant Albert would remain home to help with the endless work that farming demanded. But Albert himself felt something quite different. The rejection stung, a mark of inadequacy that he would carry with him as Europe moved inexorably toward war. When war broke out in August 1914, everything changed. France mobilized, and young men across the nation answered the call to defend their homeland against the German invasion. Albert watched as men from his village marched away to war, and something inside him burned with determination. Despite his father's protests and his previous rejection, Albert desperately wanted to fight for France. One day, in direct opposition to his father's wishes, he took his bag and simply ran away from home. He traveled to another district and reported to the Allen training camp, where officials, unaware of his previous rejection, assigned him to the 30th Battalion of Chasseurs. Military training, however, proved to be a bitter experience for Albert. His superiors assessed him poorly, and his fellow soldiers did not respect the small, seemingly weak recruit who had joined their ranks. He was mocked and dismissed, treated as someone who had no business being in the army. His temper, bottled up from years of being underestimated, finally exploded. In a moment of frustration and wounded pride, Albert walked off the camp without permission. He was immediately caught and arrested for desertion, a serious military crime that could result in severe punishment. When brought before his superior officers to answer for his actions, Albert's defense was simple and direct. He was not a deserter. "Bad soldiers are sent up there," he said, "but I want to go where we fight." He hadn't run away from the army. He had run away from being treated as worthless. He wanted to prove himself in real combat, not waste away in a training camp where no one believed in him. Perhaps something in his defiant words resonated with his commanders, or perhaps the army simply needed every man it could get. Whatever the reason, on July 3, 1915, Albert was assigned to the 27th Battalion of Chasseurs aux Alpins, a unit engaged in fighting in the Aisne region of northern France, in what is today the Hauts-de-France region. This was no ordinary battalion. The Chasseurs Alpins were elite mountain troops, specially trained for difficult terrain and known for their discipline, endurance, and fighting spirit. The Germans had given them a nickname that spoke to their fearsome reputation, the Blue Devils, a reference to their distinctive blue uniforms and their seemingly diabolical ability to appear where least expected and fight with relentless determination. For Albert, this assignment was exactly what he had wanted, a chance to prove himself in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. He did not have to wait long for that opportunity. Albert quickly volunteered for a dangerous mission: to destroy a German blockhouse that had been causing significant problems for French forces. These fortified positions were typically well defended, equipped with machine guns, and considered nearly impossible to assault without significant casualties. Most soldiers would have thought twice before volunteering for such a mission, but Albert saw it as his chance to show what he was capable of. Under the cover of darkness, he crept forward alone toward the enemy's trenches, moving silently through the torn landscape of no man's land, past the shell craters and barbed wire that marked the deadly space between the opposing armies. As he approached the German blockhouse, Albert observed the enemy soldiers through gaps in the fortification. It was a cold night, and he noticed that the Germans had gathered around a stove inside the blockhouse, seeking warmth against the bitter chill that plagued soldiers on both sides of the trenches. They were clustered together, their attention focused on the precious heat, their guard lowered in what they believed was the safety of their fortified position. Albert saw his opportunity. With remarkable ingenuity and nerve, he crept up to the blockhouse and threw a handful of grenades down the stove chimney. The explosion that followed was devastating. The confined space amplified the blast, and the Germans inside were caught completely by surprise. Several were killed instantly, and the survivors, dazed and terrified, believed they were under attack by a large assault force. They surrendered immediately, never imagining that their position had been taken by a single small French soldier. Albert returned to his base carrying the captured machine guns and escorting 8 German prisoners, a stunning one-man assault that instantly made him a legend within his battalion. But this was only the beginning of Albert's extraordinary war. In another incident that would become part of his growing legend, Albert found himself in a trench at Sudel in Alsace after a fierce German bombardment. The shelling had been intense and accurate, and when the smoke cleared, Albert looked around and realized with horror that he was the only survivor of his position. His comrades lay dead around him, victims of German artillery. Any reasonable soldier might have retreated at this point, falling back to report the loss of the position. But Albert was not interested in retreat. Instead, he gathered the weapons of his fallen comrades, rifles, machine guns, whatever he could use, and positioned himself strategically along the trench. Then he began to fire, moving quickly from position to position, using different weapons, creating the illusion that the trench was still fully manned and defended. He would fire a burst from one location, then quickly move and fire from another, keeping up a constant volume of fire that suggested a full squad of soldiers holding the line. The Germans, preparing to assault what they believed was a weakened position, found themselves facing what appeared to be determined and resolute resistance. They could not know that they were being held off by a single man moving with frantic energy from position to position, firing constantly, creating the impression of a well-defended garrison. The enemy artillery continued to shell the position and German infantry probed for weaknesses, but Albert maintained his deadly deception. Hours passed, and eventually the Germans, convinced that the position was too well defended to take without unacceptable losses, gave up the attack and withdrew. When French reinforcements finally arrived, they found Albert Roche alone, surrounded by empty shell casings and the bodies of his comrades, having single-handedly held an entire section of the line through sheer courage and tactical cleverness. Albert's willingness to volunteer for dangerous missions became well known among his officers, and he regularly went on reconnaissance patrols deep into enemy territory. These missions were among the most dangerous assignments a soldier could undertake, moving through German-held areas, gathering intelligence, observing enemy positions, all while trying to remain undetected. On one such patrol, things went terribly wrong. Albert was captured along with his wounded lieutenant, both men taken prisoner by German soldiers and brought behind enemy lines for interrogation. They were separated, and Albert found himself isolated in a bunker with a German interrogator who sought to extract information about French positions and plans. But Albert Roche was not the kind of man who accepted captivity passively. Waiting for the right moment, he attacked his interrogator with desperate fury. The fight was brief and violent, and when it was over, the German officer lay dead, and Albert had seized his pistol. But Albert did not simply escape. Instead, he turned his situation into another impossible triumph. Moving through the German position with the stolen pistol and extraordinary audacity, he managed to capture not just 1 or 2 soldiers, but an entire group of Germans, convincing them through sheer force of personality and the element of surprise that they were surrounded and should surrender. When Albert Roche finally returned to French lines, he was carrying his wounded lieutenant on his back while marching ahead of 42 German prisoners, an achievement so extraordinary that it seemed more like fiction than fact. Perhaps Albert's most dramatic moment came during the Second Battle of the Aisne in 1917, one of the bloodiest and most devastating engagements of the entire war. The Aisne offensive was a disaster for the French army, with massive casualties and little strategic gain, and it was in this hellish landscape that Albert's captain was seriously wounded. The officer fell in no man's land, that nightmarish strip of earth between the French and German trenches where nothing lived, and death reigned supreme. No man's land was constantly swept by machine gun fire and artillery, a place where men died quickly, and where the wounded often lay for days, crying for help that could not come without risking more lives. Albert's captain lay there, bleeding, dying, impossible to reach through the storm of fire. Albert Roche made a decision that would have been unthinkable to most soldiers. He decided to go after his captain, to bring him back regardless of the cost. He crawled out into no man's land, moving slowly, painfully, through the mud and shell craters, under constant fire. Bullets cracked overhead, artillery shells exploded around him, and he pressed himself into the earth, moving inch by inch toward his wounded officer. It took 6 hours of crawling under fire just to reach the captain, 6 hours of expecting death at any moment, of feeling bullets pass close enough to touch, of hearing men scream and die around him. When he finally reached the captain, Albert found him barely alive, too weak to move on his own. Albert began the agonizing journey back, dragging the wounded officer through the hell of no man's land. It took another 4 hours. 4 more hours of crawling, pulling, struggling through mud and blood and horror, before he finally reached French lines and handed the captain over to stretcher bearers. Exhausted beyond anything he had ever experienced, his body pushed past all reasonable limits. Albert collapsed into a guard hole and fell into the deep sleep of utter exhaustion. He was awakened sometime later by a patrol who discovered him sleeping at his post. The soldiers who found him did not know what he had just done. They only saw a soldier sleeping on duty, and sleeping while on guard was a capital offense, punishable by execution. The army could not tolerate guards falling asleep, as such negligence could cost lives and positions. Despite Albert's desperate attempts to explain what had happened, he had no witnesses to verify his story. His captain was unconscious, unable to testify on his behalf, and the other soldiers had not seen his heroic rescue. The military justice system moved with terrible swiftness. Albert was sent to a detention barracks to await execution. In what he believed were his final hours, Albert wrote a letter to his father. "In an hour I shall be shot, but I assure you that I am innocent." One can only imagine what he felt in those moments. The bitter irony of surviving everything the Germans had thrown at him, only to be executed by his own army for an offense he had not committed. He was taken before a firing squad, and the soldiers raised their rifles, preparing to carry out the sentence. And then, at the last possible moment, a messenger arrived, running toward the execution ground, shouting for them to stop. Albert's captain had awakened from his coma. The officer, once he regained consciousness, immediately asked about Albert Roche and learned of the impending execution. With what must have been his last reserves of strength, the captain had given testimony about Albert's heroic rescue, saving the life of the man who had saved his own. By the time the war ended in November 1918, Albert Roche had been wounded 9 times in combat. He had been shot, shelled, gassed, and exposed to every horror that the Great War could produce. He had survived when countless others had not, and he had personally captured an astonishing 1,180 German prisoners over the course of the war, a record that seemed almost superhuman. Yet, despite all these incredible achievements, despite his legendary status among the soldiers who served with him, Albert remained a second-class soldier. He had never been promoted, never given the rank that his service deserved, largely due to bureaucratic oversights and his humble origins. Officers were drawn from educated, wealthy families, and a farmer's son from Réauville, no matter how brave, simply did not fit the traditional mold. On November 27, 1918, barely 2 weeks after the Armistice, Albert was brought to Strasbourg for a ceremony. The city had just been liberated from German control, returned to France after decades of occupation, and the people of Alsace were celebrating their return to the French Republic. A huge crowd gathered at the balcony of the city hall, and there Albert Roche was presented to General Ferdinand Foch, the Supreme Allied Commander, the man who had led the Allied forces to victory. Foch had recently discovered Albert's service record and had been astonished by what he read. "He has done all this, and he has no rank," Foch had exclaimed in disbelief. Now, before the crowds of Strasbourg, Foch spoke words that would define Albert's legacy. "Alsatians, I present to you your liberator, Albert Roche. He is the first soldier of France." The first soldier of France, the highest praise imaginable, spoken by the most powerful military commander in Europe. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Albert Roche, the small farmer's son who had been rejected as too weak to serve, stood before them as the embodiment of French courage and sacrifice. After the ceremony, Albert received the honors that had so long eluded him. He was awarded the Cross of the Legion of Honor from General de Mauduit, commander of the Army of the Vosges, and was invited to dine with General Mangin, one of France's most celebrated commanders. He received 12 military citations, including 4 from the Order of the Army, and was decorated with the Officier de la Légion d'honneur, the Médaille militaire, the Croix du combattant volontaire, and the Croix de guerre. In 1920, Albert received perhaps the most solemn honor France could bestow. Along with 7 of his comrades, he was chosen to carry the coffin of the unknown soldier at the ceremony at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. This ceremony was deeply meaningful to the French people. The unknown soldier represented all those who had died in the war, all the sons and fathers and brothers who had been lost, many of them buried in unmarked graves or simply disappeared in the chaos of battle. For Albert to be chosen as one of the pallbearers was recognition of his status as one of France's greatest soldiers. In 1925, he was part of a French delegation to London, accompanying General Henri Gouraud, to attend the funeral of Field Marshal John French. There, Albert and 5 other representatives of the French army were invited to dine with King George V of England, an extraordinary honor for a man who had begun the war as a rejected recruit. But despite all these honors and ceremonies, Albert Roche was not a man who sought fame or glory. After the war, he returned to Valréas in the Vaucluse, back to the rural landscape of southern France, where he had grown up. He worked modestly as a municipal laborer, doing simple work for the local government, living the quiet life of an ordinary French citizen. He married a woman from Colonzel in the neighboring Drôme, and together they built a family. They had 2 children, daughters named Magali and Marie-Pierre, and Albert devoted himself to being a good father and husband. Eventually, he found work as a firefighter in the powder magazine of Sorgues in the Vaucluse, a responsible position, but far from glamorous. He lived simply, never seeking to trade on his fame, never asking for special treatment or privileges. To those who knew him in his daily life, he was just Albert Roche, a quiet man who did his work and cared for his family. On an ordinary day in April 1939, Albert was traveling to work on a bus, as he did every day. As he descended from the bus, a car struck him in a terrible accident. The car, ironically, had once belonged to Émile Loubet, a former president of the French Republic, a strange and tragic connection between the humble soldier and the highest levels of French society. Albert was rushed to the Sainte-Marthe Hospital in Avignon, but his injuries were too severe. He died on April 14, 1939, at approximately 5 in the morning. He was only 44 years old. The historian Pierre Miquel later reflected on this tragic end in his book La Grande Guerre au jour le jour, published by Éditions Pluriel. Miquel wrote, "This man had gone through 4 years of war. He had been wounded 9 times. He had been close to death 1,000 times, almost unjustly shot as a mutineer. He had escaped all dangers, all accidents. All of this to be killed 20 years later on his way home on the descent of the bus. It was a crushing irony that a man who had survived everything the Great War could throw at him, bullets, shells, gas, capture, torture, execution, should die in a simple traffic accident on a peaceful street in France." When news of Albert's death spread, Édouard Daladier, who was then Prime Minister of France, personally requested that full military honors be given at his funeral. The nation mourned the loss of its first soldier, the man who had embodied the courage and sacrifice of an entire generation. Albert was initially buried in Sorgues, but his story was far from over. On September 22, 1967, nearly 3 decades after his death, his body was transferred to Saint-Véran Cemetery in Avignon in the Vaucluse, where it remains today in Square 40, North Row, Grave 15. In 1971, the village of Réauville, where Albert had been born, erected a cenotaph to his memory in front of his family's house. A stela was inaugurated by Mayor Gabriel Jarniac, ensuring that the small village would forever remember its most famous son. In 2018, La Poste, the French postal service, issued a commemorative stamp bearing Albert's image, introducing his story to a new generation of French citizens. And in 2023, the Swedish metal band Sabaton, known for their historical songs about military history, released an album titled Heroes of the Great War that included a song called The First Soldier, dedicated entirely to Albert Roche. Through these tributes and memorials, Albert's story continues to inspire people more than a century after he first ran away from home to join the fight, determined to prove that even the smallest and weakest-looking person could possess the heart of a lion and the courage to become the greatest soldier France had ever known.